Tonight is our opportunity to journey to the cross through the 12th century worship of tenebrae, or a service of darkness. It is an opportunity to intentionally reflect on the last day of Jesus from the garden to the cross and beyond.
And as was his habit, went to the Mount of Olives, his place of secret prayer. There he told the apostles, "Keep praying for strength to be spared from the severe test of your faith that is about to come." Then he withdrew them from a short distance to be alone. Kneeling down, he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup of agony away from me. But no matter what, your will must be mine." Jesus called for an angel of glory to strengthen him, and the angel appeared. He prayed even more passionately, like one being sacrificed, until he was in such intense agony of spirit that his sweat became drops of blood, dripping onto the ground. When Jesus finished praying, he got up and went to his disciples and found them all asleep, for they were exhausted and overwhelmed with sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "You need to be alert and pray for the strength to endure the great temptation."
After Jesus finished this prayer, he left with his disciples and went across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden. Judas, the traitor, knew where this place was, for Jesus had gone there often with his disciples. The Pharisees and the leading priests had given Judas a large detachment of Roman soldiers and temple police to seize Jesus. Judas guided them to the garden, all of them carrying torches and lanterns and armed with swords and spears. Jesus, knowing full well what was about to happen, went out to the garden entrance to meet them. Stepping forward, he asked, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. Now Judas the traitor was among them. He replied, "I am he." And the moment Jesus spoke the words, "I am he," the mob fell backwards to the ground. So once more Jesus asked them, "Who are you looking for?" As they stood up, they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I told you that I am he. I am the one you are looking for. So if you want me, let these men go home."
Meanwhile, Peter was still sitting outside in the courtyard when a servant girl came up to him and said, "I recognize you. You were with Jesus, the Galilean." In front of everyone, Peter denied it and said, "I don't have a clue what you're talking about." Later, as he stood near the gateway of the courtyard, another servant girl noticed him and said, "I know this man is a follower of Jesus the Nazarene." Once again, Peter denied it, and with an oath, he said, "I tell you, I don't know the man." A short time later, those standing nearby approached Peter and said, "We know you're one of his disciples. We can tell by your speech. Your Galilean accent gives you away." Peter denied it, and using profanity, he said, "I don't know the man." That very moment, the sound of a crowing rooster pierced the night. Then Peter remembered the prophecy of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times." With a shattered heart, Peter left the courtyard, sobbing with bitter tears. Before dawn that morning, all the chief priests and the religious leaders resolved to take action against Jesus and decided that he should be executed. So they bound him and led him away to Pilate, the Roman governor. Now, when Judas, the betrayer, saw that Jesus had been sentenced to death, remorse filled his heart. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and religious leaders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying an innocent man." They replied, "Why are you bothering us? That's your problem." Then Judas flung the silver coins inside the temple and went out and hanged himself.
Before dawn that morning, the ruling priests, elders, religious scholars, and the entire Jewish council set in motion their plan against Jesus. They bound him in chains, took him away, and handed him over to Pilate. As Jesus stood in front of the Roman governor, Pilate asked him, "So are you really king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You have just spoken it." Then the ruling priests over and over made bitter accusations against him, but he remained silent. So Pilate questioned him again. "Have you nothing to say? Don't you hear these many allegations they're making against you?" But Jesus offered no defense to any of the charges, much to the astonishment of Pilate. Every year at Passover, it was the custom of the governor to pardon a prisoner and release him to the people, anyone they wanted. Now Pilate was holding in custody a notorious criminal named Barabbas, one of the assassins who had committed murder in an uprising. The crowds gathered in front of Pilate's judgment bench and asked him to release a prisoner to them, as was his custom. So he asked them, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Pilate was fully aware that religious leaders had handed Jesus over to him because of spite and envy. But the ruling priests stirred up the crowd to incite them to ask for Barabbas instead. So Pilate asked them, "What do you want me to do with this one you call King of the Jews?" And they all shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate asked. "What evil thing has he done wrong to deserve that?" But they kept shouting out with a deafening roar, "Crucify him at once." Because he wanted to please the people, Pilate released Barabbas to them after he had Jesus severely beaten with a whip made of leather straps and embedded with metal. He sentenced him to be crucified.
Then the guards took him into their military compound, where a detachment of nearly 600 soldiers surrounded him. They stripped off his clothing and placed a scarlet robe on him to make fun of him. Then they braided a crown of thorns and forcefully shoved it onto his head. After placing a reed staff on his right hand, they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Then they spat in his face and took the reed staff from his hand and hit him repeatedly on his head, driving the crown of thorns deeper. When they finished ridiculing him, they took off the scarlet robe and put his own clothes back on him and led him away to be crucified.
And as they came out of the city, they stopped an African man named Simon from Libya and compelled him to carry the cross for Jesus. They brought Jesus to Golgotha, which means Skull Hill. And there the soldiers offered him a mild painkiller, a drink of wine mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. Then they crucified Jesus, nailing his hands and feet to the cross. The soldiers then divided his clothes among themselves by rolling dice to see who would win them. And the soldiers stood there, watching to see what would happen and to keep guard over him. Above his head, they placed a sign that read, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of Israel." 2 criminals were also crucified with Jesus, one on each side of him. And those who passed by shook their heads and ridiculed him, saying, "We heard that you boast that you could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Why don't you save yourself now? If you're really God's son, come down from the cross." Even the ruling priest with the Jewish scholars and religious leaders joined in the mockery and kept on saying, "Yeah, he saved others, but he can't even save himself. Israel's king, is he? He should pull out the nails and come down right now. Then we'll believe in him." He put his trust in God, so let's see if it's true and see if God really wants to rescue him. For he said, "I am the Son of God." Even the two criminals who were crucified with Jesus began to taunt him, hurling their insults at him. Surrender. Good Friday always brings that word to mind. Jesus' death and all of the reasoning behind. But Good Friday always brings me back to a thought. It brings me to the thought of Mary, the mother. She was entrusted with this godson. There is an image that's usually put out at Christmas, the image of a manger at the foot of the cross. And yet, before that image could even come to mind, Mary had to surrender. From the moment she said yes to the angel, within her womb, the picture of surrender to the God of the universe. Her life was no longer her own. Mary followed Jesus all the way to the cross. You know that song, "Mary, Did You Know?" that sang almost every Christmas. I think she did. She knew from the time she said yes that this was not an easy road. She trusted God, the same God who had delivered the people of Israel time and time again. She was a willing vessel, surrendered. That word, surrender. But we're here tonight because of the ultimate picture of surrender. As we have listened to the scriptures read, hearing once and time again of the very steps that led to that place, we hear the scripture. But do we listen with surrendered hearts? Do we find ourselves someplace in the crowd? Do you think of yourself as someone in the midst of the crowd, or just as one of Jesus' disciples hiding in a corner? The crowd knew nothing of what Jesus was really up to. If they did, they might not have said the same thing. But they didn't see what was to be. He was not the king they had expected, and therefore they wanted no part of him. They chose to call for his crucifixion based on the fact that he didn't live up to their expectations. They stood and mocked him. But Jesus himself was not focused on human expectations, but on what God had called him to do. You see, even though he knew, he still prayed in his humanness for the Father to make another way, knowing there was none. And in that very moment, Jesus surrendered his human will to the will of the divine. Surrender. Who? Me? That's the hard stuff. You know, with a talk about the death and the dying, it's always the difficult part. We like to smooth it over and rush right on past. I have read all the stories about what it really would have entailed in the first century for a man to be tortured, and I can barely make through it. I have not I can't even remember one of the documentaries or movies that have portrayed the same, that I have been able to make it through to the crucifixion. I'm always broken and aching in my soul by the time it's there. Jesus truly showed us what surrender looked like. It wasn't easy or pretty. It was looking at the willingness to follow God even when it's unpopular, facing ridicule and torture, unswayed and determined by his conviction. Surrender. Who? Me? There are times in our lives that we see the cruelty of the world around us and it seems too much to bear. It weighs heavy, and sometimes we feel so alone. Maybe even we feel as though we must cry out just as Jesus did, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You know, we struggle with the concept of surrender because surrender looks a lot like death. Death of my own plans, the death of my desires, the death of my pride, the death of self. Remember, as we have journeyed through the Sermon on the Mount, the way of Jesus, the way of the kingdom of heaven, is an upside-down concept that no one in the world would understand. Jesus calls us to listen and obey, to follow. Follow me, he said. It is not something we do on our own. But Jesus not only taught us to do so, but he lived the very example of surrender, calling us to live under the power of God, surrendered lives. Surrender. Who? Me.
It is now only midday, yet the whole world became dark for 3 hours as the light of the sun faded away. And suddenly in the temple, the thick veil hanging in the holy place was ripped in two. Then Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Father, I surrender my spirit into your hands." And he took his last breath and died. When the Roman captain overseeing the crucifixion witnessed all that took place, he was awestruck and glorified God. Acknowledging what they had done, he said, "I have no doubt that we just killed the righteous one." The crowds that had gathered to observe the spectacle went back to their homes, overcome with deep sorrow and devastated by what they had witnessed. Standing off at a distance were some who truly knew Jesus, and the women who had followed him all the way from Galilee were keeping vigil.
Evening was fast approaching, and it was preparation day before a Sabbath. So, a prominent Jewish leader named Joseph from the village of Ramah courageously went to see Pilate and begged to have custody of the body of Jesus. Joseph was a highly regarded member of the Jewish council and follower of Jesus who was eagerly awaiting kingdom of God. Pilate was amazed to hear that Jesus was already dead, so he summoned the Roman officer who confirmed it. After it was confirmed, Pilate consented to give the corpse to Joseph. Joseph purchased a shroud of fine linen and took the body down from the cross. Then he wrapped it in the linen shroud and placed it in the tomb, quarried from out of the rock. Then they rolled the large stone over the entrance to seal the tomb.